we're so aligned with like geopolitical hegemony that it's ridiculous. Like on every level of society. Like whatever Pentagon says, will just trickle down into even like alternative podcasts here in Sweden. It's like since the White House didn't say anything about the genocide because they were complicit, you know, our prime minister has not a single time during this whole time condemned Israel. And so Joe Biden all of a sudden said, but the settlers in the West Bank, that is not cool. Like that Israel should kind of like, put some halt on this. All of a sudden you heard our prime minister say, well, yeah, actually the settlers in the West Bank, that's really bad. Then you heard our newspapers saying, well, the settlers in the West Bank, I can agree that's bad. All of a sudden these alternative rights.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Kajsa Ekis Ekman, a Swedish journalist, activist, and the author of 4 books on human trafficking, prostitution, and the economy. She is currently the editor-in-chief of Parabol Press. Previously, Mrs. Ekman worked for various Swedish outlets, but was let go in 2022 after critically covering the unfolding Russo-Ukrainian War. Hence, today we want to talk about her work and the media situation in Sweden. Mrs. Ekman, welcome.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Great to speak to you. And especially, I like your name, Neutrality Studies, because, up until a year ago, we could have been part of that. Sweden and Switzerland were neutral countries, but, that's now history.
I used to study you as a case, and now it's a historical case only. Let's start with that. What do you think about Sweden's transition from neutrality into NATO?
Oh, it's awful. I mean, it's awful in so many ways. It's awful because, I think historically it's a very bad decision. I mean, we were neutral for 200 years. We did fine. We weren't in any wars. We're a peace-loving country. We do export weapons though, and we have had close collaboration with NATO. I mean, so we weren't 100% neutral still, I would say. But, it saved us from a lot of wars. And it also, left its mark on our culture that if you see a fight, the typical Swedish person is not like the typical American that will jump in on one side, but would rather try to separate the two people fighting. And also it's awful because we weren't asked. We didn't have a referendum on this. It was just top-down decision taken overnight.
Why why do you think that was? Like the from my own research, I know that there was a progression as well, right? Because Sweden used to call itself neutral until about the 2000s, and then started calling itself non-aligned, and then it started dropping also references to that, and then came the war, and then the switch happened. Does the media environment have something to do with it?
Well, I mean, I think if it weren't for the Ukraine war, of course, we would still be neutral. We wouldn't be in NATO. But I mean, I think that was, I don't know if it was the reason as much as the excuse, because this had already been happening, as you're saying, slowly. Um, but what surprises me about this is the fact that everybody just bought into it like, oh, if we don't join NATO, Putin is going to invade us. I mean, nobody talked about that as a possibility outside of Sweden. I mean, there was no international discussion saying like, oh, Sweden is next, and never has been. I mean, we lived through 2 world wars up close. We've had, I mean, all these invasions. I mean, the Soviet Union sometimes invaded other countries close by. Nobody ever said that was the reason for joining NATO. I mean, that was the reason for keeping out.
Mhm. And don't make
So,
yourself a target. That was the strategy, right?
yeah, exactly. And, our diplomacy was about try to make friends in other countries and understand other people. And that way you can create peace. And now it's, just send arms, send soldiers. I mean, I think it's terrible.
I also don't. I also wonder about the how Sweden is currently portraying its security situation, because I saw something very, very scary, and I'm going to make a separate program about this, but it's a brochure that apparently was sent to Swedish households in English called in case of crisis or war, a little yellow brochure that tells Swedes how to behave when the war comes. Have you seen that brochure?
Yeah, they sent it here, but because there was such a brouhaha internationally about it, I gave it away to some Spanish relatives that came to visit because they were like, "We want this. We want to show it back home." So, I mean, I don't think that's such a big deal because they've sent these out for decades.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not a new thing. They do send these brochures out just in case. It's not just a war, it's in case there is a climate crisis or, what to do, how to get, to stock up on cans or things like that, where you can find drinking water. So, I mean, essentially, I think that's a good thing. But of course, now it comes in the context of, Swedish people being, at least in 2002, I mean, there was real panic. People were writing in local Facebook groups, like, where are we going to hide when Putin comes?
You mean 2022, right?
Yeah. What
Yeah.
did I say?
2002, but you mean after the yeah, no, but it's
Yeah, yeah,
just
yeah.
in
Yeah,
2000 things
2022,
were still
exactly.
fine, right? After Ukraine, that's when people got scared.
Yeah, I mean, it was a fear that was installed in us by our politicians and our media. And then it was like kept alive by people themselves. Like people were thinking of moving, like where should I move in the country to be safe? I mean, and it's bizarre because we were told overnight that, Ukrainians are like our brother people and what happens to them is happening to us. I mean, nobody in Sweden basically knew where Ukraine was before this. Nobody had ever talked about that country.
Yeah, because
So
like Sweden sees a lot of its security in the context of the Nordics, right? Of Finland and Norway, but not of Central Eastern Europe.
no, we've always thought that those countries, they're east. We're the west. So that doesn't have anything to do with us. And you can call that an egotistical attitude, but it's been our attitude for many, many years now. Let people solve their problems themselves, like we don't have anything to do with that. But I think crucial to Sweden's decision of joining NATO was also the fact that Finland switched from one day to another, and then we felt like we didn't want to be the border of NATO. So I think that's when our Social Democratic Party switched overnight without having an internal democratic, decision about it. There was no extra Congress. Basically, there was an information meeting online, and that was it. And I mean, our historic leader, Olaf Palme, he's turning in his grave. How much did he not fight for neutrality and for Sweden to be with the third world? And now
Yeah,
we're with imperialists.
the Olaf Palme was a very fascinating and very engaged politician who would exactly like others like Bruno Kreisky in Austria rotate in his grave. And Olaf Palme, he was murdered, right? Is it
Yeah, that we know. Who did it, we don't know.
it's still unknown today who murdered Olaf Palme?
Yeah, nobody knows.
Well, do you think that this change of this change of how Sweden views its foreign policy, and that apparently a large group of politicians decided that really NATO is the only way to go. Is that something that grew during this time of the after the Cold War? Do you think that feeling was there already before? Because I talked to another countryman of yours, Ola Tunander, and
Mm.
he was talking about the submarine affair and how the submarine case instilled already a lot of fear in people's hearts, and how today we understand that those were psyops, that these submarines never came from the Soviets, except for the one that actually really crashed and that was visible for a long time. Do you see any kind of other mechanisms through which Sweden was scared into NATO?
I mean, there are a group of there is a group of men in Sweden that are like perpetually worried about being invaded. I would say like women in general in Sweden, we never think about this at all.
Mm.
Like we're not worried about that. But there are a group of men who are kind of obsessed with this. And who spend their time just like worrying about like the status of our army and of our weapons and our borders and things like that. So every time something like that happens, whether it was the submarine scandal in the 80s or whether it was now the sabotage of cables that turned out it was also an accident. I guess you heard about this.
Yeah.
That was wow for a couple of weeks, and now they're coming. And a lot of these men have high positions. So every time there is a thing like this happening, they get to speak out in the media. And they always say the same thing, like we need to spend more money on defense and less money on other things such as healthcare and, education and things like that. So this has always been the battle, that, where should we put our money? And now they're so happy because we're putting billions into NATO. Whereas our social system, which made us famous back in the day, the Swedish welfare system, we didn't have rich or poor. We didn't have beggars on the street. You could be the child of like an unemployed single mom and you still had the same material standard as the child of a CEO. Like that's just going away now.
That's very sad.
Yeah.
And it has to do with the militarization of the Nordics, do you think?
Well, it doesn't help exactly when your education system is underfunded and the health system is underfunded, over privatized, and added to that, we're going to take from our tax money and put into NATO. And there's also another thing that we did that actually has nothing to do with NATO that I don't understand why we did, which was the DCA agreement,
Mm.
where we now signed a separate agreement to allow the US total access to 17 military bases in Sweden, which, it looks like the agreement that Iraq signed after having been invaded, except Iraq got this exception in the treaty that the US was not allowed to put nuclear weapons. We didn't even ask for that. This treaty looks like we were at war with the US and lost.
You're not the first one to tell me that. I had Tuomas Malinen from Finland on the channel recently, and he said the same. This is basically an occupation agreement because these people, and these are not NATO troops; these are U.S. troops,
Yeah.
and they don't even have to pay taxes in your country, not even value-added tax.
Look,
Every
they don't
coffee
even
that
have
they
to
buy, they
obey
can get a
Swedish
receipt.
law.
Uh,
They don't even have to obey our laws. We don't even have the right to check them when they go in and out. What are they bringing? Who are they? What passports do they have? Like, they can just come and go. And I think what the Swedish people don't know is that they're not here to defend us. Like, there's nothing in this DCA treaty that speaks about them defending us. They're here for their own purposes. Whereas we think, oh, it's good that they're coming, so they're defending us because that way Putin won't come.
But honestly, have you ever read of anyone who gave you or heard of anyone who gave you a reasonable argument why Putin would want to go to Sweden? I mean, I understand why the Finns, I understand Finland, having had like 2 wars, 3 wars with the Russians over time and having like, I understand it there, but the Swedes. Is anyone seriously scared of Mr. Putin wanting to just, rule from Stockholm? I mean, it's a nice city, but
You know, I always thought this was bullshit, but if you told people back in 2022, right when the whole thing was happening, you know, Putin was a mixture in the collective consciousness, a mixture of Hitler and Napoleon.
mm.
That's what they were saying. Like, if you don't stop him now, he's just going to go all over the place because he's a crazy madman.
Is that belief still around, or have the last 3 years like sobered up like the perception of Russia a bit?
I think it just has to do with fear doesn't tend to persist over time because if they try to scare you into thinking something is going to happen now and then, years go by and nothing happens, I mean, of course, you tend to relax a little bit. And we're seeing that the whole Ukraine war was a fiasco. from beginning to end. So I think people, yes, are sobering up a little bit. But what you also have to understand is that the media has been obsessed with Putin. And I mean it literally. Like when we looked at the headlines of our two major tabloids, and I don't mean the headlines that you see when you buy the actual newspaper, I mean the ones that you see when you just pass the store. Like, I don't know how it is in your country, but here, when you pass a store, like any store, like a cigarette store, like a supermarket, a store where you go and buy milk and bread, like outside will be like the main headlines
Mm.
of the tabloids. So you know what the news are, even if you don't buy it. So during the first 2 years, over 80% of them were about Putin. Like, not the word Russia, not the word Ukraine, Putin, right? So it was like nothing was happening in our country. The only thing that was happening was Vladimir Putin all the time. It was Putin has cancer. Putin is scared of dying. Putin might die. He might lose the war tomorrow. Putin has a girlfriend. Putin this. I mean, it was just bullshit news just to make us focused on this one guy.
But yeah, in that case, not even the country, not the military, not the actual military threat that you can think about, but just about this one person, and as
Yeah.
if though he was devil incarnate plus
Yeah, totally.
the, the coming of Russia itself.
Yeah, people think that. People think that. I mean, it's like they don't call it like Russia's war, they call it Putin's war.
Hmm. But at the same time, the, the Russia as a country is still also demonized, right? As in sanctions and so on. Do people in Sweden or do people in Sweden like differentiate between the government of Russia and the Russians, or is that also all lumped together inside Putin?
In the beginning of the Ukraine war, there was a kind of intent to make the Russian people into like an innocent, oppressed people who were suffering from a cruel dictator, a bit like they were trying with the Iraqis during Saddam Hussein, But that was kind of like just dismissed. And instead, there was another discourse that became dominant, which was the Russian people are evil too. So, I mean, there was an article in our biggest newspaper, which basically said that the Russian soul is murderous. You can just look at Dostoevsky and
Really?
Russian literature. I mean, it was one article, I mean, it was one person that wrote it. I'm not saying that that was the dominant discourse. That was very extreme, but it kind of gives you a feeling of the atmosphere.
I was actually wondering about this for a while because I think when we talk about the Europeans and their approach to Russia, I mean, some colleagues call it Russophobia, that there's a deep-seated Russophobia, and I thought that was correct until I realized that I don't think the Europeans are actually scared so much of Russia or the Russians as it's just like some form of weird focus for dislike or hatred. Do you what do you think? Like this mixture of being scared versus wanting it to go away?
It was funny, like that the same year, 2022, I was just like bending down on the street to pet this dog that I saw. Like somebody was walking their dog. And then I said, "Oh, that's a cute dog." And the owner goes, "Yeah, but it's a street dog from Russia. So you can't really trust it." And I said, "What? Yeah, but it's Russian."
Really?
Yeah. I said, "Okay. Right."
This is bizarre. It's a
I mean,
bizarre thing to say.
Yeah, but it's also their own dog. I mean, I think that's even stranger. But the thing is, this didn't start now. Like, we've had a type of like Russophobia or Russians as the enemy since a very long time. And this was mixed with like, anti-communist sentiment during the Cold War. So this is now like blended together.
Yeah,
We don't really know if what we think is that Russia is still communist or that the bad thing about communism was the fact that they were Russian or it's just all a big mixture. Like yesterday, for example, now that we're speaking, yesterday was the day of the liberation of Auschwitz, and I was looking at all the news outlets, and nobody mentioned who did the damn liberating of Auschwitz. It was like Auschwitz was liberated in 1945. Yeah, but who did it? Nobody. even said it was the Red Army. Because, of course, that's taboo.
We're kidding not we're kidding ourselves. I mean, we are bullshitting ourselves currently in Europe into believing into a very bizarre version of history, a version in which it was the Americans that liberated the European continent in the Second World War from Nazism, in which the Russians always were the communist enemy. Um, and now we are realizing probably also that it was not communism that was the problem. The problem was that it was Russia that did
Yeah.
the communism. To me it throws a completely new light on us Europeans of how we think about our own history in a completely bizarre way.
Yeah, I think you're right, but I'm not sure you know, uh, I don't know if it comes from us or if the US wants us to think this way. Because if you read, Brzezinski, for
Yeah.
example, about Eurasia and how he speaks about it, it makes sense that the US, being separated from us by a whole sea, and then we have Russia and Europe actually being neighbors. We're the same continent. Like this division between us is made up. So is it in our interest to have like a perpetual type of war or hostility with our own neighbor? Or is it in the interests of the Americans who want to make us believe this? Because imagine how powerful it would be if like China, Russia, and Europe became one whole big thing. I mean,
If we
now that's unthinkable, but like land-wise, it makes more sense.
if we stopped being at each other's throat on Eurasia, that's the only thing that could potentially really endanger the North American power over everybody else, right? So sowing division, as Brzezinski said, is a recipe for U.S. interests. But the question to me is like people like Olaf Palme understood that, and people like in Finland, Urho Kekkonen, they knew
Mm.
that they were in dangerous positions and that being neutral and having your own position was beneficial to them. But we lost that, and we lost that idea over the period of that U.S. unipolarity. Um, for the case of Sweden, and you've lived through that time, right? Can you explain to yourself what it was that eradicated this idea that Sweden should look out for Sweden and not for the U.S. interests?
I mean, I think it's happening in the whole of Europe, 20 years ago, Europe had certain independence, with the Iraq War and the way that we said no and the way that we had, I mean, left wing or right wing wasn't really the point. We had big leaders, who could put their foot down. I mean, we don't have that today. We don't really have any big leaders in Europe. Like Macron is trying a little bit, but he's like not really filling out the suit.
No.
So we've basically become like a kind of appendix to the US. Now, I think maybe the Swedes think that we're too small, like to be on our own. And I think they think that it benefits us in the long run to stick with imperialists.
You also frame them as imperialists, right? Like
The
the way that
US.
domination is emanates from Washington and Brussels.
I mean, it's a fact. It's not an opinion. I mean, it is, I think, the only imperialism that we have. I mean, now this word is thrown about as if, there is Chinese imperialism in Africa, there is Iranian imperialism in the Middle East, there's Turkish imperialism, I mean, no, in any sense of the word or any definition, I mean, I think there is just one imperialism today, and that's the US-led imperialism. And then Europe is kind of like hangers on to this.
The reason why I'm asking is that right now we have these two ways of framing what's happening, and funnily enough, one way of framing it is decisively a left-wing thing. Imperialism is
Hmm.
a left-wing kind of Marxist analysis of what's happening, and then colleagues on the right wing they tend to use the word globalism, not imperialism, to
So now
describe
you know which side I'm on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the same side. I'm a paying social democrat in Switzerland, and I tell that to people because I mean, there's also no reason why we cannot work with people on the right. But um, this the framing of this as being an outgrowth of how the empires used to work. Does this make sense to you, or does also the way of this idea of globalists who have have an agenda to create a structure of making everybody else dependent on them and then ruling through that? Does that also make sense to you, or why is it that you frame it as imperialistic?
I mean, I've never seen like a kind of coherent definition of what a globalist actually is.
True.
To me, it sounds like a kind of sloppy way of speaking, which kind of almost borders on conspiracy. Whereas when we speak about imperialism, there's a whole th body of theory behind that. What do we mean? Well, I personally use it in a kind of strict way. What I mean is a capitalist country can't just dominate with economic means, like, you use the IMF, you use the World Bank, you use sanctions, like they do, to a lot of countries they don't like. They just say, we're going to starve you to death. You're not going to be able to trade with anybody, and we'll create living hell. And then you'll see how you like it being against the US, right? But if that's not enough, there is the military threat, and that's what I refer to as imperialism. The rest is just kind of capitalism with a bit of blackmail, if you know what I mean. But I think that it's important to make this distinction between when you are adding also the military threat and invasions, because otherwise any country with companies that go into other countries could be named as imperialist. That's what they're trying to say now, like China's building lots of stuff in Africa. Oh, now they're imperialists. Whereas a lot of people in Africa say, hey, this is good. We're getting a lot of infrastructure built. And I think the difference is that China doesn't tell them who their president has to be, what policy they have to adopt. Basically, it's a kind of trade, you know. I don't know if it's win-win 50-50 or if it's win-win 90-10, but I wouldn't call it imperialism the same way that it is when you invade a country, stab its leader to death, and have a government that basically functions via emails from Washington.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. And we have enough people who, I mean, I know enough people from the global south who do argue that when the Chinese come, we get a bridge. When the Europeans come, we get a lecture. So, um, and that's the thing. I mean, ODA, sorry, and aid from China is often not is usually not conditioned on any
Mm.
kind of local political developments, whereas the Europeans and the Americans very clearly say, "Oh, we have human rights standards, and you have to implement this and that." And these human rights standards then also only go so far. They never go far enough in order to actually put regulations on mining companies, um, their own.
Of
Is this
course. No,
discourse
but
how?
I mean, I think it's kind of like a modernized version of, the old European colonies, how they went there and went, with the sword in one hand and the cross in another, and said, well, you also have to not only obey us, but you have to believe in Christ. And then they all said, okay. And now they're coming back and saying, well, now this Christ thing is gone. That's outdated. Now you have to believe in LGBTQ, and you have to believe in this, and you have to adopt this policy document. But of course, as you're saying, this is not real, It's a way of explaining imperialism to their own people. Because when they go back, they have to say, well, why were you in Afghanistan? Why were you in Iraq? Well, we're fighting for freedom. Look, the women are oppressed, or look, they had an awful dictator and things like that. So I think that's basically something they do for the home market.
Why do you think it is that we Europeans are not able to grow out of that mindset? Especially since the mindset is now being done to us. I mean, we are now experiencing kind of this American colonization of Europe and even the European mind, right? That is willing to go and fight the wars of somebody else, and the ones who have it the worst, the ones who are absolutely hit the worst, are the Ukrainians that are currently that were transformed into the battleground for a proxy war.
Mm.
And yes, we cannot exonerate Russia, and this is a dynamic and so on. But the willingness of the Europeans currently to go and fight a war, which we have definitely nothing to win and everything to lose, that makes no sense to me. And still, we cannot get out of that mindset. Can you explain that to yourself somehow?
Well, I don't know if the answer lies in psychology. Is it the European mind or the American mind? Because it's true that we do tend to think that we know better. Like the typical European will go abroad and explain the country to the people there.
Mhm.
You know?
Explain them their country. Yeah.
Yeah, explain their own country to the people there.
Yeah.
But I think we're seeing cracks in this mentality. I think that that's why they started getting scared of TikTok and other types of apps where I think young people in Europe are and in the US are seeing, oh, the world isn't the way that they told us. You know, in other countries, people sometimes have it better than us.
Mhm.
We have no health care, the Americans are saying. Look at the Chinese. Now they're talking to them on a one-to-one basis in these apps, and they're seeing, look, the Chinese have it better than us in a lot of ways. How can this be? Have they lied to us?
So in a sense, it's getting harder to demonize others, isn't it? It works. It worked beautifully with Russia, but it's not working that well anymore with China in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, I'm hoping that, we're getting there and, with Palestine also, we've seen, I think, a major crack in imperialism's way to, get their own people on board with whatever they do. I mean, here we see that their own people has basically said, we're not with you on this.
The people, yes, I mean that's the point. Like the European population has seen much more through the Gaza genocide than they have through the war in Ukraine. But the governments are, to me, still extremely online. I mean, just 2 days ago, this weekend, actually, the Swiss arrested the founder of the Electronic Intifada, Ali, I forgot his last name, sorry.
Alia
And
Bonima, I
Ali
saw
Bonima.
this.
And
Yes.
he was detained for 3 days, administrative
Wow.
detention. He didn't see a judge. It's incredible. And then he was deported. Um,
But listen, let me ask you this. Is this something that a government that is sure of itself does? Or is this an action of a kind of desperate type of regime that's kind of losing power?
the bizarre thing about this episode over here is that it was basically done on the behest of a provincial government member at the canton of Zurich, who then
Mm.
requested the federal police, and that dude is even a social democrat like me,
Wow.
and 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 I don't understand how they got to that to do, but it's not so much and the whole government that does this. This is individual people with enough power to have certain things happening.
Yeah, but you see that because you're close. But I mean, if this was happening in China,
Mm.
Europe would think China is arresting so and so.
Yeah,
Of
which
course, in every country, it's somebody who initiates this, and it goes down to a certain bureaucrat somewhere sitting in an office. But, from outside, the way it looks is
yeah,
as if the whole country is doing it. And I think, this type of desperate action used to be something that you would see outside of the West.
yes,
Like we're seeing with Algeria, for example, arresting this French Algerian writer, and now France is saying, "Oh my God, how can you do this?" And Europe and the US used to be kind of more sure of themselves, not to have to do these things. In 2011, with all the, indignados and the Aganactismenno that were all over Southern Europe and protesting, it was more like, oh, just wait and see, they'll get tired of it. You didn't have to do mass arrests. And the fact that they're doing this now, cracking down on freedom of speech, I think it shows a kind of desperation. I don't think it shows confidence.
are they are these imperial interests losing the narrative battle, actually? Because I think that's what they're afraid of. Because you need to control the narrative to a good extent in order to make sure that at least 85% of people are on board with the imperialism you do, right? With sending the bombs to Israel to bomb the hell out of the Gazans and commit a genocide. But that's kind of now slipping through their fingers.
Right. I mean, think about it like this. If you are a young person, say that you are about 20, and you participate in these marches for Palestine because you're upset about the genocide, you participate, you suck in all this rhetoric about Zionism, and then, you're really convinced. Nothing happens to you. You study, you get a job, you get married, you might, settle down, and maybe your opinions will change. And you will say, when I was young, I was crazy.
Mm.
Society is quite good after all. But let's say that you're arrested. Let's say that you spend 2 weeks in jail, or, you are even, sentenced for something. You're always going to remember that. So even when you settle down, you marry, you get a job, you're still going to think, that was not okay. So what they're creating here is like permanent dissidence. Do you see what I mean?
I see what you mean, yes, and I
Yeah,
think
if they
you're
would
right.
just let it be, things will fade away on their own. But if you start cracking down, you create enemies for life.
And is that happening in Sweden too? I mean, is the crackdown toward dissidents getting stronger also, even in Stockholm?
Yeah, 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 of course. There's been, I mean, not that many like clashes with the police in terms of violence as we've seen in Germany, for example. But what we have seen is people who've been fired for pro-Palestinian stance on social media. I mean, we've had teachers being fired because they expressed something on Twitter. We've had, TV personalities not being able to do a TV show about losing weight or something like that because they expressed something pro-Palestinian. So that type of censorship is becoming quite extreme and ridiculous.
What what do you think caused it inside the Swedish society? Like that because this is a crackdown of the of the society against its against their own. This is not necessarily foreign impacted. This is the society cracking down on their members.
Yeah, well, it's the kind of elite cracking down on people. I mean, most people think this is ridiculous because the whole raison d'être of, Western capitalism as told to us was freedom, right? We are not like North Korea. Here you can say what you want. Well, now we're seeing that's not really the case anymore. Like last time I went to Cuba, I tried this. Like I went with Turkish Airlines, so I went through Istanbul and then I landed in Havana. And in every place, like Stockholm, Istanbul, Havana, I checked like a number of websites to see in what place I could see the most websites. And they were different in every place. But I mean, the place that I could see the least number of websites was my own country. Can you understand that?
Lockdown, yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
epistemically.
they're saying, oh, we can't fight like, whatever, like child porn, but we can shut down everything that's Russian in one day. Like, so I think that's a bit strange. They haven't really had the time to explain all this to us, like why we can't see what we want to,
You're
why we
talking
can't
about something like Russia Today or Sputnik that in Sweden you cannot access, right?
we
Well,
cannot access this. If you're an academic and you are like maybe in some joint project with Russia, you had to quit all that.
mm,
Even if it's something totally non-political, like something about medicine. I mean, you had to cut all contacts with Russia and I mean sports, like you name it, anything. And I think, people were okay with that. Like, yeah, they did invade Ukraine, so that's kind of fair. But then when the Palestine thing happened, and you realized, first of all, what's the difference between a war and a genocide? And second of all, why are the Israelis treated like everything is fine? Why were they allowed to come here during the Eurovision Song Contest? Like nothing happened. Why are we signing arms deals with them?
like nothing happened because, I mean, the victimhood narratives. on both sides are very clear, right? The good side and bad side is very
Mm,
clearly distributed. The
mm.
Ukrainians are the victims and the Israelis are the victims, and we need to stand with the victims as the Europeans. As crazy and lunatic as the framing itself is, but that's the mechanism, isn't it?
Yeah, but I don't think anybody here believes that the Israelis are the victims. I mean, nobody
Good.
believed it from the beginning. Sweden recognized Palestine in 2014. I mean, up until October 7th, basically the few pro-Israeli voices here were extremists. I mean, real extremists. They weren't people that were credible or were, in the mainstream of politics.
And now, did that change, or is it still
Now
the
the
case?
extremists have taken over, you see? So I think it's interesting because now in politics, our government is right wing with the support of the extreme right party, which is an ex-Nazi party that did a total makeover and now became super pro-Israel. Um,
Oh,
you see, and so these extreme voices are like now the hegemony. But I think that you can tell in the media too that they've had to kind of shift what intellectuals are being called in as experts, both on the Ukraine issue and on the Palestine issue, because the old ones won't do because they're too educated and because they won't say what they're supposed to say. So now you get crappy intellectuals that are like YouTubers that have their own channel that are being brought in like, oh, let's debate this, you have your own channel because they don't really have any real intellectual to support their discourse. Do you see it's becoming really absurd? Like all the professors they used to call in to comment, whatever thing are now being labeled like, oh, they're dangerous because they're not saying what we want.
this is the problem when you have a media environment that is more about the message than about what's going on. Would you agree that European media at the moment, at least mainstream media, is in the business of shaping opinion much more than depicting it or
Oh,
the world?
totally. Totally. When I started writing in the media, and like everybody else, read Chomsky and, the concept of manufacturing consent. And I was like, yeah, this sounds really terrible, but I can't see this really happening anywhere
Mm.
because I was allowed to say what I wanted. I've been writing for more than 20 years. Nobody ever told me what to write. I mean, the owners of whatever corporation I was working for didn't like go into my texts and say like, oh, we don't like this word, change it. Like that was just wasn't happening. And then boom, times changed. Like the Ukraine war started, like rules were different. From one day to another, they told me, like in one of the places I was working for, because I was working for different newspapers. But actually, the interesting thing was that the one that let me go was a kind of fringe left-wing
Really?
newspaper. It
Uh-huh.
wasn't the biggest ones. It was a kind of fringe newspaper, left-wing, that because I wrote something about Ukraine, like from one day to another, after 10 years, they said, no, we can't have you working here anymore.
Did they give you actually the reason? Did they say it was this article, or they just?
I mean, the thing was, so I wrote this article where I kind of just tried to analyze this newspaper called Kiev Independent. Like, where
Mm.
is it coming from? Because everybody in the Swedish media started quoting this newspaper. So I was just interested to know, like, how can a newspaper that is 4 months old become the most important voice on Ukraine? Who's working there? I looked up who they were. Some really had this shady background of being like embedded in the Azov battalion and like seemed openly Nazi on their own Twitter. Most of them were just like Western educated from the start, like had received all these grants, from Canada or from the EU or from the US or like Western government funded from the start, and so was that newspaper. So I just wrote basically maybe before you quote it, you have to know that this is not neutral, like it has this perspective. And the owner or the editor in chief received the article and said, "Oh, it's a great article. It's brilliant." Printed it. Then people started saying, Oh, but this could be seen as like Putinist narrative. But he couldn't fire me because of that, because he himself had printed it. So then he would have to go. So then he kind of like just went through all my social media and found this discussion where we're talking about RT, like Russia Today, and where I said, it's not just a propaganda newspaper, like it does have journalism too. And then he said that that was awful.
Really, that was the
Yeah,
reason that was given to you, that
yeah,
you spoke well about RT, that you
yeah,
said not everything is propaganda on RT.
yeah,
That was the reason.
yeah, that was the reason.
Jesus.
Yeah,
Uh,
that was the reason. So, yeah, you see, like, it's just strange because we were used to having like kind of freedom of speech or, like, okay, maybe I don't agree, but that's the way that she thinks, stuff like that. But the same editor that let me go, he also wrote like, we have had like total freedom of speech here, but now this is going to change. Like, we can't allow like just anything to be published anymore. But, and this I think is the tricky part. He never said explicitly, like, what are we not going to allow from now on?
hmm.
And that I think is instilling a kind of fear in journalists because, I mean, if they know, you can't say, I don't know what it could be. You can't say that the invasion of Ukraine was right. You can't say that, there is democracy in Palestine, or I don't know, whatever thing they say. Like, okay, give us a list of what we can't say, and then we can debate that list. But if you don't even give us what we can say, we're going to go around and be scared all the time and think like, oh, I'm just going to say what somebody else already said because that's safer. So then you lose this kind of creativity that you have as a writer and the freedom of thought.
Self-censorship. It
Yeah,
will
something like that.
it will lead to people trying not to be controversial in the first place. So this I absolutely agree with you that this is what's going on in a lot of European countries at the moment, and it harks back to what you said, that the promise of capitalism is now eroding. Whether that promise was ever true or not is different, but the very forces that tell us that we need to guard ourselves against autocracy and be so careful
Mhm.
because evil Putin will come over and invade us all and transform us into an autocracies. These are the forces that are actually working on making sure that we cannot be free anymore in the media or society.
I know. I know. It's crazy. And it's like all the words are kind of being eroded. Like, what do they mean nowadays? Like, what does democracy actually mean? You know? What does freedom of speech actually mean? Like, is it just a code word? Are all these just code words for like Western imperialism? Or like, do they mean anything in themselves? Like, when we say like never again, when we speak about the Holocaust, do we actually mean that? Or is it just a code word?
No, I think you're right. It's degenerating into code words for being for the virtue signaling, and it can only be meant in certain ways. And we see that in Europe at the moment with Romania, right? Cancelled election. Even though I'm not a right winger, but I don't think you should do that. If a right winger wins an election, then well, they win.
Mm.
The discussion in Germany about banning the AfD, I don't like them very much, but
Mm.
that doesn't seem very democratic to me. And we are going down that drain.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just think it was so crazy yesterday because all our politicians and all our, local, governments on every level and all institutions posted, Auschwitz was liberated today, 80 years ago. Like, let's make sure we remember this and that it should never happen again. I mean, we all knew that there were like two things that were not allowed to be said there. And one was who liberated Auschwitz. And the second was, it is kind of happening again.
What else were the last 1.5 years? I mean, people incarcerated in a plot of land and incinerated.
Hmm.
That sounds kind of Auschwitzy to me.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's not going to happen in exactly the same way, to exactly the same people. But, in school, when we were taught like to remember, we were taught that you were allowed to, you know, use it as an analogy
Mhm.
for contemporary things. Not that it was supposed to be like some fixed event in history that you were only supposed to draw lessons about that time, So, yeah, I think we're just, soon we're just gonna start repeating code words. Like it's not going to be real thinking anymore. It's not going to be real. I mean, it's just going to be these phrases like, my heart goes out to the victims, or just ready-made stuff like all the time.
Yeah. And and thereby masquerading, I mean, making a mockery of what it actually should mean if there was some serious thinking involved in it, which it isn't. Do you have any do you have any hope that the way that we also talked about before, that society sees now through more of this, that there will be a correction effort coming, or are you pessimistic about, let's say, Sweden?
I'm quite pessimistic for the coming years, because what I see is that like we're so aligned with like geopolitical hegemony that it's ridiculous. Like on every level of society. Like whatever Pentagon says, will just trickle down into even like alternative podcasts here in Sweden. It's like since the White House didn't say anything about the genocide because they were complicit, you know, our prime minister has not a single time during this whole time condemned Israel for anything they do in Gaza. For anything they do in Gaza. Not one time has he said anything about that, and same goes for our major newspapers. And so Joe Biden all of a sudden said, but the settlers in the West Bank, that is not cool. Like that Israel should kind of like, put some halt on this. All of a sudden you heard our prime minister say, well, yeah, actually the settlers in the West Bank, that's really bad. Then you heard our newspapers saying, well, the settlers in the West Bank, I can agree that's bad. All of a sudden these alternative right-wing podcasts also got the permission to say, so they were also saying, well, what they're doing in Gaza, self-defense, Hamas, whatever, but the settlers in the West Bank, that's not cool. I'm sure that all of these people did not know that they're acting in this way, that, they're given permission from the US. But that's the way it works organically.
Yeah.
So it's just so tied to this. And I think when we did have free speech in Sweden, I don't think I knew that it was because we were neutral. I think I thought that it was just because we had democracy.
This is a very, very important point that you just made. This epistemic tickling down and the willingness, the readiness to kind of your compass to decide that this is North, and Washington Post and New York Times, that's the North.
Yeah.
And then we are integrating ourselves. This is fascinating. It's kind of insane, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, but isn't it also so fascinating that sometimes there is more freedom of speech in the heart of the empire, like in the actual US, than in the periphery?
Yeah.
So a lot of the time you can make a point by telling some, extreme right-winger that even Haaretz or even Washington Post is saying whatever thing. Why can't you say it? Oh, and then they get all like, oh, I didn't know that. You see, and I think I have a theory on why this is so. And that's because in the US, you know, they need some free debate because they are the leaders of imperialism. So they have to know what to do.
You have to
They
figure it
have to
out.
know who to invade next. They have to know if they're going to go to Syria or Iran or Venezuela or North Korea. So they need some kind of debate on their goals so they can let people who are critical of their policy to speak out. Whereas we're just supposed to follow. We're not supposed to lead. So there is really no function of free debate here. It won't help them.
This is very well put. The question then is like, how does that happen in free societies, that this self-policing then starts? Because I don't think it's It's not done by, by brute force from the outside. It is a sociological
Yeah,
whirlwind that then drags us into that. And now we're sucked in. We're really deep down the
yeah,
imperialists behind.
yeah.
How to get out of that?
Well, no empire lasts forever, so I mean, it will go down eventually. I don't know how or when,
Yeah, yeah. I
but
just
I
hope.
mean, I usually because of internal
Yeah.
contradictions.
Yeah, maybe we really have to start systematically compare the current situation with, the way that the Soviet Union imploded and its satellites, went away, and how the satellites used to be even more like try to adhere to Moscow, the Moscow itself, and ultimately it was Russia that blew up the Soviet Union, right? Not
Yeah.
the outside. In any case, we are nearing the hour, so Kajas, where can people? Sorry, Kajsa. Where
Okay.
can people find your writings? Where should they go if they want to read from you?
If they speak English,
Yes.
well, well, yeah, that's kind of hard because I do write sometimes in English, but it's mostly I write in Swedish. So sometimes I write for Le Monde Diplomatique or Truth Dig or Feminist Current or different magazines, but I think they can follow me on Instagram and just press translate because there I post
True.
everything.
True. And by the way, Swedish and English are very good to translate. The translation works fantastically. Where in Sweden do you usually post your articles?
So I write for Aftonbladets Kultur and for Dala-Demokraten and Parabol Press, which is my own newspaper. It's a monthly magazine. So, but I post generally everything on Instagram and a portion of it on Facebook.
Okay. Everybody, if you want to read more, go to Instagram and Facebook. I will also put some links into the description. Kajsa Ekis Ekman, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.